Hello, my name is Brian Smith. Thank you for your interest in my work. This masterclass is designed primarily for marketers and strategists in pharma, medtech, and other life sciences companies, which is where my expertise lies. This is the third in a series of masterclasses and all of them can be found on my YouTube site. If you have any questions about them, or you would like PDFs of the articles that support these masterclasses, then please get in touch with me. I hope that you're going to learn something today, and the best place to learn from is from something that you already know and already are familiar with. So let's start with a statement of the obvious that I think will be pretty non-contentious for you. So strong strategies align with the market. They exploit opportunities and threats in the marketplace, and they mitigate threats from the marketplace. The problem is, of course, that your market is dynamic, it's moving, it's a shifting target. So you can't sit and wait for the market to change and then react to it, because we're relatively slow to change. Our businesses are surrounded by regulation, they're technically complex, and if we sat and waited for a market to change and then reacted to it, we'd constantly be behind the curve. So that means that we have to anticipate change and design strategies that anticipate the future, which of course implies that there's a capability we need, an organizational capability we need to anticipate what's over the horizon. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I want to stress, just to set your expectations correctly, that what I'm not going to be talking about today is forecasting. Okay, I've spent enough of my career forecasting, and it's about extrapolating from the present. It's using existing metrics. It's usually quantitative, and it's usually built on supporting short and medium term operational plans. And it's an essential task, but that's not what I'm talking about today. If forecasting is about looking out of the window, then anticipating the market is more like a long range weather forecast. It's about identifying new things in the market. It's about using multiple sources of information, and it's primarily in support of medium and long-term strategic plans rather than operational plans. So to be clear, I'm going to be talking about forecasting today and not about anticipating the market. It's worth taking a moment to think about what companies are trying to achieve, what the desired outcome is when they do this anticipating the market activity, because all companies do it to some extent. We gather information about the outside world, things going on outside of the company. We analyse that information in some way, and what we're trying to draw out of it are likely changes in our customers, who they are and what they want and what they're going to do, our competitors, who they might be and how they might behave, and also our complements. Complements is a term you hear less often in strategic analysis, but it means other organisations and entities whose work impinges directly upon ours. So that might include regulatory bodies, but it might equally include firms that are doing things related to us. So if you supply products into a cath lab, then one of your complement firms is an imaging company, for example. So all firms do this to a greater or lesser extent. What's interesting is that some firms do this really well. Some firms don't do it very well at all. And in my research, I've been looking at the differences between the two. There's companies that do it well, there's companies that do it less well. And the answer really is summed up in this cartoon, which you're probably familiar with. It's an old cartoon, which is companies that are good at this have a deliberate, thoughtful process. Companies that are less good at it tend to do it in a very sort of ad hoc manner. They may not appear ad hoc. They quite often generate huge slide decks with hundreds of slides, but they're mostly about regurgitating known information. The good companies identify new things that nobody has seen before. So if you accept that this is what you're trying to do. If you accept that that's what the process that we're trying to understand and improve, then I can move on. But I'd like to spend just a second on thinking about how the things that have come out of the research before I get into the detail of the process, because there are three fundamental lessons that come out of it that it's useful to understand because it's what the process is meant to address. The first thing that comes out is that in forecasting the future, you have to understand that the dog wags the tail. By that I mean that the changes we're interested in tomorrow, things in what is traditionally called the task environment of customers, competitors, partners, other stakeholders, is driven by what is happening today in the remote environment, a social, legal, economic, political, technological environment. So if you want to know what's going to happen to your customers tomorrow, you look at what's happening in the remote environment today. So the dog is wagging the tail. The second thing to come out of the research is that this thing of what you would call the butterfly effect. You've probably heard of the story of a butterfly flapping its wings and causing a hurricane 600 miles away or something. By this, I mean that things that don't seem directly relevant can be important. So you can think of the remote environment, in fact, in two parts. That there are things that are obviously and directly relevant, such as disease patterns or lifestyle trends or healthcare budgets. But this is what you would call the proximal remote environment. But your business can also be affected by the distal remote environment. And this includes things that are less directly relevant to your market, but they create long-term trends. So trends in political thinking, developments in platform technologies, and so on. All of these affect your business in the medium to long term. And the third general lesson that comes out of this work that I find very interesting is that, as one research respondent put it to me, it's the ingredients. It's not the ingredients that matter, it's the cake that matters. And what we mean by that is that firms are good at understanding how the environment is changing, tend to look at not at individual factors and their implications, but how those individual factors interact with each other to cause broader implications for the market. Now, these three lessons, the dog wags the tail, the butterfly effect, is important. It's not the ingredients, it's the cake. They may, when you look at them, seem obvious to you, but in practice, most pharma and medtech companies don't listen to these lessons. Most pharma and medtech companies focus very much on the task environment, or sometimes just on the proximal remote environment. And they worry a lot about the immediate impact of single factors. This simply doesn't work, from what I can see. You can't anticipate the weather by looking out of the window. You need another way of doing it, a more sophisticated, long-term process to do it. So today I'm planning to take you through the process that I see working in companies for how to do that. But first I want to touch upon the things that create barriers for companies in doing this. And this is important because any process that you're going to build needs to somehow overcome the barriers that are inherent in the process. And there are 5. The first and most obvious one is that there's an awful lot of information to process, which you can't just cherry pick in certain areas. You have to look at the whole big picture, so you need to scan widely. Any effective process would scan widely. The second is that those things going on in your market environment are very noisy. There's a lot of noise and very little signal, which means you will need a way of filtering and identifying the signal in the noise in any process. The third interesting thing, of course, is that this process will be administered by human beings, and all of us have mental constraints. We have cognitive biases, as the psychologists call it, about how we frame questions and how we look at the world. So we need a process that somehow overcomes those cognitive biases. The fourth factor is that all of these separate factors don't work individually, they interact and adapt to each other. Our market environment is what scientists would call a complex adaptive system. And that means we have to understand how they interact and what are called second order effects, when one implication of the situation interacts with another to create a combined implication. And the fifth and very prosaic one is that the best people to do this, of course, are the people who work in the business and who understand the market. But they have real jobs. They have everyday jobs. They're trying to do the operational tasks as well as this long-term strategic stuff. So you need a process which allocates time. Otherwise, the operational tasks will just be driven. The operational tasks will simply drive out the strategic scanning tasks, as I would call it. So with that, I'm going to lead into the process, but let me stress for a moment that what I'm showing you really is a composite process. It's not really the process used by any single company. It's a composite of what many good practice companies are doing. So I take the best parts of what each company is doing and create a kind of perfect composite process. So that's what I'm going to address today. The first thing I'd like to get across is that you need to think that this process happens in 5 sequential stages. It starts with scanning the remote environment. It then goes on to sorting the information that comes out of that scanning. Then it leads to an analysis process, which draws out the implications of what you've seen. Then it leads into a synthesis process, which is all about synthesizing those implications to see how they interact with each other. And then finally, there's a validation process. Each of these 5 steps, incidentally, are designed to overcome some of the barriers we discussed in that earlier slide, some of those difficulties that I mentioned. So if that's the basics of the process, the first step then is to create a scanning team, to establish a scanning team. This is usually a small team, 5, perhaps 10 people, or smaller in a smaller company. And it's the job of this team to look at the environment, to scan the remote environment and identify the factors that might be important. Now, once the scanning team is formed, it's important to make scanning the environment part of their formal objectives so that they allocate enough time to the task. Again, as I said, if you don't, then their operational jobs will displace the scanning activity. The second step to consider is to set that team to work. The challenge here is to overcome these cognitive biases that I talked about, because we all have them and we have a tendency to look where we want to look and see what we want to see. In practice, you get around this by 4 tricks of the trade, as it were. The first is to have that cognitively diverse team that look at things in different ways. The second is to divide the remote environment up into 4, technological and sociological, proximal and distal, and allocate team members to looking at different parts of that environment. The third is the use of scanning templates that I use in my work, where you essentially give the team direction as to what sort of things they're looking for. And then the fourth is to use a wide range of sources, both general for business generally and specialised relating to your market. And they can include anything from conferences and books and trade magazines to academic journals to what experts are saying on Twitter. There's a huge range of sources you can use, and the exact design of that scanning method is very particular to the market involved. Now, the scanning team's task, I should stress here, is continuous. It should be looking all the time, and not just for a couple of months of the year around the planning cycle. And then when you do that, the outputs of that process should be a long and quite diverse list of things that might or might not have implications for the business, things that you observe happening in the social and technological environment, both proximally and distally. Now, that long list of things you see going on becomes the input for the next phase, the sorting phase. The point of the sorting phase is to try and make sure that you're achieving a balanced picture of the environment, not one that's skewed. But it's also to try and filter out some of the noise. So what I see happening here, and what I recommend doing, is sorting all the things you see into 4 boxes: 2 technological boxes, 2 sociological boxes. Some for the supply side of the industry, but things that affect what we can make, and things that affect the demand side of the industry. The value of doing this is first of all, you filter out things that don't appear to have any impact on either the supply side or the demand side, so it's an initial filter. But the second is for the balance point of view. If you have, I would typically expect a company to have 20 or 30 items in each of these boxes. But if you find yourself with 50 in one box and 2 or 3 in each of the other boxes, that's telling you that your scanning process is skewed, is biased, and that you need to go back and fix it before you go on. But what comes out of this process is, this stage of the process is these 4 filled boxes with, as I say, perhaps 20 or 30 items in each box. And those things provide the inputs for the next stage, the analysis stage. Now, the purpose of the analysis stage is to identify the implications of each of those 80 or 100 factors that you might have seen in the marketplace. For example, you might see in the social environment, the distal social environment, that there is an aging population. And from that, you might draw a direct implication of increased disease prevalence of the disease that you're trying to treat, for example. Just a little note here, the common mistake companies make is that they look for very specific implications for their product or their current strategy. Better companies tend to look for broad implications of the market that are agnostic of whatever product or strategy they have. But in any case, the target output here is 1, sometimes 2 implications for each of the factors that you saw. So if you got 80 factors in your 4 boxes, you might expect 80 implications or so. Direct, immediate implications of the type that I gave an example of a moment ago. And it's this long list of direct implications, what the jargon would call first order implications, that becomes the input into the next stage, the synthesis stage. The synthesis stage is, in my opinion, the most intellectually challenging, difficult stage, and it's best done if you have a small team of bright people focused on the task. It involves taking all of those first order implications, that long list from the analysis stage, and seeing how they interact together to form second order implications. So to give a very simple example, you might see that greater demand, which comes from an aging population, combining with slow growth in healthcare budgets, which you might identify from the social distal environment, the economic environment. So if you put together increasing demand and slow rate of growth of money supply, then that would create a second order implication of there's likely to be a greater demand for value for money from your customers. So that's the sort of thing that you would see. This list of second order implications is usually quite a lot shorter than the list of first order implications. In my experience, it comes down to by a factor of 2 or 3. So if you had 100 first order implications, you might end up with 30 or 50 second order implications. And those second order implications then feed into the validation stage. So the output of the synthesis stage becomes the input to the validation stage. The validation stage begins with sorting of the outputs. And sorting these 30 or 50 second order implications into 2 categories. Those, first of all, that are generally positive for your business, we call them putative opportunities. And those that are generally negative for the business, we call those putative threats. And I say putative because that means they might not be, we think they might be, but they might not be genuine, valid opportunities and threats. We don't know yet because they haven't been validated. So the output of this sorting step is 2 lists, one of putative threats, one of putative opportunities, each perhaps 15 or 25 items long. And those lists then go into the final stage, the final part of the validation. We test them, we validate them by asking 4 questions. So putative opportunities are validated as real opportunities, valid opportunities, by asking 4 questions. Putative threats are validated as real threats by asking 4 different questions. CLAL and USUL, the acronyms on this chart, are simply a shorthand for the 4 questions, which I'll come on to in a second. Okay. Typically, asking these questions reduces these putative lists, which remember were 15 to 25 items long, each of them, down to about 5 or 10 validated opportunities and 5 and 10 validated threats. And they all become your final output for this analysis, this emerging properties analysis, as it's called. And those opportunities and threats that have been validated become one of the inputs into the SWOT alignment process, which incidentally I'll be covering in another later masterclass. But you need to know what CLAL and USUL stand for. So let me cover that. I should ideally spend more time on this, but I'm going to cover that in the later masterclass. But in short, an opportunity is only an opportunity if it's complementary or at least non-conflicting with other existing opportunities. It's only an opportunity if it's large enough to be worth exploiting, if it's commercially accessible to the company, and that opportunity lasts long enough for you to get at it and exploit it. Importantly, an opportunity is only a valid opportunity if it passes all 4 of these tests. Okay? You have to get through all of these. In exactly the same way, you validate a threat by asking 4 different questions. A threat is not a real threat, a validated threat, unless it is unmitigated by other factors, unless it's significantly impactful on the business, unless it's defended against by, if it's not a threat, if it's defended against already by something else you're already doing, or if the threat has to last long enough to be a problem. So these are what are known as the reality filters. 4 separate questions for each category that help you sort the false threats and the false opportunities and identify the really genuine valid ones. Only opportunities and threats that are validated by these tests are strategically significant. So let me try and summarize what I've said with a kind of simple example. The scanning process will produce lots of factors, but one, for example, in the technological factors shaping the supply side, might be growth and algorithm power. That obviously comes from the distal technological environment, and it affects the supply side because it affects what value you can add for your customer. On the demand side of technology might be the increasing use of wearables health sensors. That's part of the proximal technological environment, things like smartwatches and wearable devices and so on. On the sociological factors shaping the supply side, you might identify the emergence of digital health standards, one of the things that's happening in the environment at the moment. And in the distal sociological environment, you might see the emergence of new social habits of self-management. We see these, for instance, in retail and finance and other areas where people are managing their lives online more, or through devices more. Now, each of these 4 implications and 4 factors that we've identified, and remember that in real life we might see 80 or 100 of these, each of these has a direct implication. So the next stage would be to look at that. So the growth in algorithm power might, for instance, you say the direct implication of that is it becomes easier to create value from patient data because the algorithms are more powerful. The increasing use of wearable sensors has a direct first order implication that patient data will become more common, more freely available, more ubiquitous. The emergence of digital health standards helps to reduce the barriers that there are to providing digital health solutions. And these social habits of self-management are likely to create increased patient demand from patients who want to manage their health through digital tools. So those are the, in this case, 4 first order implications, but remember in practice you might have 80 or 100 of these if you're scanning your environment correctly. Those 80 or 100 direct implications would feed into the synthesis stage. Now, with a simplified example with only 4 factors, it's very straightforward. We would see, for example, we'd expect on the positive side, putative opportunity, to see the emergence of a self-managing segment. There's a group of customers that say we want to do this way, who would push for solutions that would have a digital self-management wraparound. On the negative side, we'd see products, offerings, value propositions that were based just on the product with no digital wraparound would be obviated, would become redundant. And that would be a negative, or at least a putative threat. We'd apply the cloud tests and useful tests, and in this case I would expect them to both pass. But in a typical environment, those cloud tests rapidly narrow down the putative opportunities that you identified. In practice, I might expect to see 15 or 20 opportunities, 50 or 20 putative threats narrowed down to perhaps 10 or so validated opportunities, 10 or so validated threats. And it's those validated opportunities, validated threats that have got through the tests that become the inputs to your SWOT alignment. They're the outputs of this emerging properties analysis. So I'm going to close with a kind of a summary, but a challenge to you really, to ask yourself, how good do you think your process is, your emerging properties analysis? How good are you at looking over the horizon? You can do this by comparing yourself to typical practice, industry standard practice versus best practice in the industry. In industry standard practice, scanning and sorting tends to be ad hoc. It tends to happen in episodes. It tends to be a secondary task without dedicated resources, and it tends to be coloured by framing biases, how you see the problem. The analysis and synthesis typically looks only at direct implications. It tends to focus on the immediate implications, and it tends to be distorted by confirmation biases, by which I mean we tend to see what we want to see. And the validation process, well, if it exists at all, it's by socialization. That is, we talk to our colleagues, we show them what we think, and if everybody agrees, we think it's valid. That's not a very good way to validate an output. Compare that to best practice, and here's where you can ask yourself how good your company is. In best practice, the scanning and sorting is structured, it's continuous, it's well resourced, it's balanced across all 4 quadrants. The analysis and synthesis looks for both first order and second order implications. It looks not only for immediate implications, but also those ones that are emerging in the future. And the validation, of course, is very deliberate and case specific, using those reality filters we talked about. So I hope that was useful. I hope that gives you something to think about. If you'd like to know more, then the simplest and easiest way is simply to get in touch. There's my email. But I'm very easy to find on the web. You can find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on YouTube too. You could look at one of the 7 books I've published on this topic. Brand therapy is the one that is most relevant to what I've talked about today. But as I say, there are over 300 PDFs on my website that you can request free of charge. So thank you very much for your interest in my work, for your attention to what I've been saying. If you find it useful, please let me know, or please publicise it on social media, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thank you.